through the provision of legal advice, you tend to be able to move the client from a state of darkness toward resolution.
Welcome to the Greener Grass podcast from BlueBird Botanicals. I'm your host, Lex Pelger. The legal world of cannabis and psychedelics is transforming. We're moving from full prohibition to incremental legalization for medicine, research, and recreation. How will all these changes turn out in the end? Who could navigate such a treacherous landscape? How about a psychonaut Freemason lawyer who has worked in the high-stakes arena of corporate finance in London and New York? Somebody who takes on drug-related cases as an ally to psychonauts everywhere. That's Robert Laurie, the founder of the law firm Ad Lucem, a board advisor for MAPS Canada, and a proud Vancouverite. We spent an hour talking about using the law to help people, what's wrong with the way Canada is rolling out legalization, and his connections to Dennis McKenna and Seth Rogen's high school drug dealer. Robert Laurie traverses all the mental spaces between psychedelica and mundane bureaucracy. I hope you enjoy. This show is brought to you by BlueBird Botanicals, to spread education about cannabis and other things on the greener side of life. BlueBird CBD oil comes from farms in southern Colorado and is grown using only water, soil, and sunlight. Go to bluebirdbotanicals.com for more info. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today with the lawyer Robert Laurie. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me.
Can you tell us, when you were young, what was it you wanted to do, and was law at all involved in that?
Well, from a young age, I definitely knew that I wanted a career where I'd be helping people. And actually, medicine was an area that I'd given a lot of thought about and thought of pursuing. But for whatever reason, the reasons being that law just became much more of an interest in terms of the ability to position oneself between the state and private citizens, or dealings between individuals and companies, or however. But for me, it was that I think the ability to be a voice and an advocate for those who don't have one. And ultimately, law and my interest in cannabis, psychedelics, civil liberties, human rights, and the environment, law has been a wonderful investment of time and a vehicle that has allowed me to meet and help people every day in respective issues and concerns, as I just set out, that I'm passionate about. And so ultimately, if you get to do what you love every day and get paid for it, it's pretty cool. That's half the battle, I think, to a happy and successful life. So ultimately, I've used law as a vehicle. After my initial education in England, I was at law school in Oxford, and I worked in the City of London in corporate finance, and particularly structuring of alternative investment vehicles and hedge funds. And ultimately, I came back to Canada 10 years ago and requalified. And while requalifying, it was reading some of the Canadian litigation, like R.V. Melmo Levine, who's a big cannabis rights activist, who ended up defending a case all the way to the Canadian Supreme Court with the assistance of John Conroy QC, who's become a mentor and actually has been a senior lawyer working with us on the Vancouver dispensary test case. So really, yeah, this is, being a Vancouver boy growing up in Vancouver. And I guess my earliest memories and interest with cannabis, I guess I'm quite proud of explaining this, is my younger brother's best friend in junior high school, and well, still to this day, was Seth Rogen's dealer for 7.5 years. And so I'm not kidding. And so the character Saul in Pineapple Express, played by James Franco, I kid you not, a lot has been taken from my brother's friend, Johnny C., or John Carr, as he's known, and which I think is quite funny. And so, even before law school and in my first week of law school, I was getting calls from friends who were having issues in the cannabis space. So I think it's only natural that I've come full circle, like Siddhartha, after my journey with London and in New York, and having also been a former securities fraud litigator, being where I am now in the cannabis space and having that, I guess, connection from Copperhead Road all the way to Wall Street has really enabled me to find myself, practice the type of practice that I want, and get to look at cannabis and issues with regards to access every day. Plus, it's enabled me to travel all over the world, as far as Australia, Germany, as well as Oregon, California, Washington, and a number of other states. Most recently, I was in Las Vegas for the MJ BizCon. So ultimately, I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of then, I guess, where I've come from, my interest in cannabis, and I guess that just leaves where we're going.
Wow, so a Herman Hesse journey with cannabis.
I guess you could kind of look at it that way, Yeah, I started in my village. I ended up through, perseverance and study and, pursuing academic interest enabled me to, go from St. George's to UBC, that's the University of British Columbia, to Oxford, and then in England. And then after that, practicing for some pretty big US and British law firms in London and New York before coming back home. And I guess after having all that international experience, I wanted to ground myself and apply it and develop and blossom, if you will, in my own neck of the woods. And so 10 years later, I couldn't be happier with what I've accomplished. And we're just getting started, really, when you look at it.
And can you tell me how you came up with the name for your law organization?
Ad lucem is Latin for toward or to the light. And so ultimately, I think it's very suitable. When you meet a client, usually it's because they're in a state of darkness, right? The old adage that it's the darkest just before the dawn applies, because usually lawyers aren't going, or clients aren't going to, or people aren't going to lawyers because good things are happening, right? It's usually you've been arrested or family issues or corporate commercial concerns, whatever, and they're in a state of darkness. So through the provision of counsel, legal advice, you tend to be able to move the client from a state of darkness toward resolution. And I'm also a Freemason, and so there's a big belief in that, always be moving towards light, towards enlightenment and resolution. And I think that's a goal that with every day, with practicing law, you want to improve on a daily basis. If you're slowly improving and striving toward the light and resolution, then it can only make for good results.
Excellent. And so what was it like to start Ad Lucem Law, and what kind of cases do you initially take on?
All right, I'll let you in on the secret here. So it was both a blessing and a curse. So I started my practice with a lawyer who was a couple years more senior. He really wanted me to join. And anyway, about a month into practice, he decided he wanted to do something else, and he literally left. And that left me in a position where, I had to now, meet bills and demands and, get work and attract clients. So it was really one of those situations that, if you want to become a good lawyer, you need to get the work. And so I ended up attending all of the local courthouses, provincial court and Supreme Court, and introducing myself to duty counsel and indicating that, I'm a new lawyer to practice. I'm looking to round out my solicitor skills obtained in London and New York practicing corporate law with the litigation barrister skills of, attending and going to court. And ultimately, that's what lawyers do, is you go to court and you get paid and advocating your client's position. And so I started to go to court and I took on legal aid files. And again, you're dealing then with people that are just happy to have a lawyer looking at their case. But when I find out you went to Oxford and used to do former like securities fraud litigation involving the SEC and the FBI in New York and other issues, they start thinking, wow, well, maybe we got a chance here. And really, it was that's how I started. And I also phoned up like lawyer referral networks where I ticked every practice area from like aviation to like, zoology law. And I ended up out of that just randomly, or not randomly, but getting cases in those areas. And if I figured I could do the work and figure it out, I would. But if I couldn't, I would bring on a more senior lawyer who had experience in that area. And in fact, one of my first legal aid cases totally was awesome because it involved a constitutional challenge involving a hereditary chief of the Haida Nation up in Haida Gwaii and his nephew shooting seals and sea lions. And so I teamed up with a senior lawyer who used to work during university on tugboats and had been involved in criminal litigation with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans in Canada. So really that gave me the confidence of, hey, I'm a smart individual, but I would gladly bring on board and defer work to senior lawyers to ensure that it's being done correctly. And ultimately that's what led me to working with John Conroy QC, who hands down is probably the godfather or the grandfather, excuse me, of cannabis litigation based out of his 25 years as a lawyer, criminal lawyer, working in the area of prison reform. And so again, let's not forget that it's only been recently that cannabis has been well available for rec purposes. It's been a pretty, evil 93 years whereby, through prohibition, a lot of good people have lost their life, liberty, and their security of the person through this arbitrary prohibition. So it's good to be, I guess, working on cases now that I enjoy and work. I have my pick of like top work in cannabis and also in the emerging area of psychedelic and alternative plant medicines. Just not to get off topic, but I'll be going to Peru in January with Dennis McKenna. That's Terrence McKenna's brother, on a trip involving ayahuasca and connections with plant medicine. So again, given that I put in my time doing work for the sake of doing it and moving on to work that interests me and doing it well, I've been able to, I guess, send messages out to the universe and I don't know, the right people and the right work, and every day it's very exciting and rewarding. You never knew who's going to call. Some days it's cannabis people like Ed Rosenthal, who's a personal friend. And other days it could be someone like Rex Weiler, who co-founded Greenpeace International, who's also an active environmental activist who, again, is also a personal friend. So, again, very blessed that I've been able to take my profession of law and apply it to causes, avenues, and cases of interest. And I'd advise anyone who has the courage to stand on their own 2 feet and start a practice. Every day it's still scary, but it's less scary as that first couple of days or months. But once you get past that and you realize, wow, I only have one life to live, and there's only so much time in this life, I might as well spend it doing things that are important to me or my family or both, as opposed to just working for somebody else. Think about it.
I'll be happy to divert into plant medicines because you're also a board advisor to MAPS Canada, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. So I'd be curious to hear more about how you got involved with that organization and what that's been like for you.
Okay, be happy to. And great question. I think the work that MAPS Canada is doing, along with what Rick Doblin has been doing out of MAPS in the US, is very exciting. In fact, I think the MAPS group is very much made up of the leading tip of the spear folks involved in the I'd call it the psychedelic and plant medicine space, but primarily in psychedelics. And so, how did I get involved with that? Well, let's just say that cannabis is a gateway. It's definitely a gateway to making better decisions. And as I elaborated earlier about how, I was able to take my practice and my life towards causes and issues of concern, well, through that and through my advocating for patient rights and for the last 2.5 years representing a good handful of the dispensaries across Canada, primarily with a focus in Vancouver and British Columbia, I've developed a reputation and a following, and I've had some pretty good results with getting things done, which got the attention of friends within MAPS who are involved in the cannabis culture space, but who, are fairly deeply involved in plant medicine and psychedelics. And so, really, it was through connections from some dear friends and from attending events put on by, what was it, the Conscious Living Network in Vancouver, who is the group that put on the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, that I started to get more and more interested. And this was about 2 years ago. I went to the first, well, I attended my first Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, and I think this last year was the 8th year. But after hearing Mark Hayden, who's the executive director of MAPS Canada, speak, and, Chris Killam, the medicine hunter, and like this year, seeing Wade Davis and meeting him along with Dennis McKenna has really led to some interesting opportunities. But how I got, I guess, from where we are to now is ultimately Mark Hayden, the executive director, and I, well, we've been working a lot together in cannabis litigation and municipal hearings involving the Board of Variants. And so I bring Mark with me as my drug expert. Mark teaches social work for the province of British Columbia. He also teaches the substance abuse and the harm reduction component of the social worker professional designation. He's also an associate professor of the UBC School of Population Studies and works in the downtown east side. So, he's able, and on top of that, he does train the police, Vancouver police, on various drug recognition techniques. So he's a good guy to know when it comes down to things. And through my involvement with him and our association and seeing that, what I can do when given an opportunity, he invited me about a year ago to be a board advisor. And that's been fabulous because it's given me a real insight to this new psychedelic community and involving and surrounding myself by really a lot of the originals in this space. So that's where we're at there.
That's excellent, especially because we actually had Mark Hayden on the Psychedelic Salon, I believe about a year ago. And he didn't even mention all of the great things in that interview that you mentioned there. He has so many balls up in the air.
Oh, he does. And I think the thing is with Mark, and in his defense, he knows so much about everything in this in so many different areas involving drugs. I mean, I know cannabis really well, and there's a handful of others that I'm getting more and more acquainted with. But Mark really is a wealth of knowledge on, you name it. And he can just literally point you to reference after reference after reference. And so that's where, again, I think, every encounter with Mark is valuable. It just depends on, what is he going to be discussing today and so on.
I really appreciate your support of MAPS Canada. They're doing such good work in so many different directions.
Well, there's a lot of interesting groups at the moment. I mean, Again, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that, well, I've been asked to do some work for Dennis McKenna, which is, again, a reason why I'll be going to Peru in January. But, without saying too much, which I'm not at too much liberty to disclose at this time, you are starting to see a lot of the established pioneers in the psychedelic space, wanting to be involved and to get the messages out to broader audiences. And the cool thing is now with technology, there's so much access to information and education that I think we're going to see a lot more education initiatives and institutionalized initiatives to get psychedelics more and more to the foreground. Because what fascinates me about psychedelics and plant medicine and cannabis is, well, in particular case of what, we're starting to read more and more about psychedelics, is that you could actually get into and dealing with the subconscious mind to get at the heart of root issues such as trauma and anxiety and PTSD and so on, which ultimately I think is interesting as opposed to the pharmaceutical answer, which is just keep taking a pill to maintain a situation, as opposed to possibly being able to really get at it and deal with the root causes, as opposed to taking just the pharmaceutical for the maintenance of it. So for me, that's fascinating, just from the context of look at the potential that the psychedelic medicines have, like MDMA for PTSD, and we're seeing psilocybin for anxiety and depression, and in certain instances where folks are suffering from massive suicidal ideation. It's the psychedelics seem to be able to give people a break and a reset and the opportunity to confront and address personal issues and concerns that I think, folks aren't having enough of an incentive or the ability to address those. So perhaps this, in conjunction with therapy and clinics and the MAPS designation that's being promoted, such as a psychedelic supervisor, and stressing the importance of setting intention, all need to come to the dialogue for discussions, especially when these substances are proving to be less harmful from a toxicity point of view, and also from a health point of view, from effects or side effects from taking them. I mean, alcohol and tobacco are the two most destructive substances out there. In fact, if used as directed, they will kill you. Yet we're being denied the opportunity from accessing safe, reliable, regulated, and again, we're going to need some form of a regulated clinical access, because, ultimately these have to be done in the right place. But at the same time, you also have indigenous cultures and societies, whether it's in the rainforest or in the prairies or the southwestern United States, that have been accessing and using these medicines responsibly as a sacrament and as a medicine without the need for all this testing and studies and restrictions and so on. So I think it's an interesting time where truly these two different worlds and these two different philosophies of medicine, health, wellness, and healing can really begin to materialize so that folks can access them.
And that must be one of the interesting parts about being in Vancouver, because it's such a place on the forefront in so many different fields. In harm reduction, you have safe injection facilities, and on cannabis as well. And there's more open-mindedness towards plant medicines. And what's it like being up there with this perspective from Vancouver that in so many ways is farther ahead?
Oh, I'm blessed to be from Vancouver and delighted that I've had the opportunity to live all over the world in some diverse places as Houston, Texas, and Dublin, Ireland. But Vancouver, let's look at it from this unique crucible where East meets West, right? You have very much a California vibe here. You have very much a frontier independent spirit of the West Coast and also a very liberalized attitude. You also have the world on your doorstep. So growing up in Richmond, we were surrounded. I had friends from probably, every Asian country possible and was exposed in one form or another to like different languages and customs. And so I think that's why Vancouver, like San Francisco, is very progressive. I mean, Vancouver in 1972, I mean, this is the city where Greenpeace started. And again, it was really out of that unique mix of draft dodgers, conscientious objectors, Buddhists, mystics, fishermen, students, environmentalists, really being in this bit of a city where where I truly believe that, proactive, sensible thought is able to pervade into the community. I mean, we may not always be right on the West Coast, but we've certainly shown for the last number of decades a very high tolerance and acceptance of the LGBT community. And that's huge in Vancouver. Vancouver prides itself on that. We've embraced other cultures and nationalities. I mean, there are some black marks in the history, of course, but more and more we've seen it's the West that has led to a more inclusive environment for folks. I mean, in some regards, I'm a Vancouverite and I can't afford to live in Vancouver anymore. I live just across from Vancouver in Nanaimo. But because of the cost of living and in some respects, there has been a catering to foreign markets and foreign buyers at the expense of the people that live there. And I mean, I'm second generation Vancouverite. I'm a lawyer who's successful. My wife's a nurse. And yet, we would struggle to afford to live in Vancouver. I'm sure I could do it now, but, it would be at tremendous cost and expense, just like we're seeing in San Francisco. So again, that's why I think we're seeing the tolerance, but more importantly, because it's the West Coast, because it's not as conservative as our central heartland states and provinces, you have, I think, and a milder climate whereby you have people living outside all year round, unlike in, more dramatic colder places. You basically have a lot of homeless and mental health issues. And that's also, Vancouver has probably the poorest and most disenfranchised zip code, the downtown east side in the whole of Canada. I mean, again, Vancouver is one of the wealthiest, and the UN declares, Vancouver is one of the most top livable cities in the world, but it also has one of the highest opioid drug rates. It also has some of the highest instances of serious mental health and drug addiction and abuse on the streets. And so something has to be, or has had to be done. And the first sort of movement of it was, the safe injection sites. What's the larger evil? Having dirty needles and AIDS and all sorts of other just terrible major public health issues proliferating, or the fact that this is drugs being made available in a safe manner contrary to the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And so it was out of that history, very much so, and out of the AIDS crisis in San Francisco, that you had compassionate clubs and dispensaries like Hillary Black and the BC Compassion Club, pave the way and blaze the trail for what we've seen now is that with 100 plus dispensaries operating completely illegally, even with a municipal license, because they are providing reasonable, dignified patient access and doing something that either the provincial and the federal government can't or won't provide. And so that's ultimately why I think Vancouver is such a unique crucible that, what's happening here is difficult to replicate elsewhere.
And to focus on the cannabis side, what's it been like as you've been paying attention to cannabis laws the last 10 years? How have they shifted? And what's it been like to watch that happen?
Well, it's a very good question, and I'll do my best to answer it. Really, the shifts and the changes have almost been happening on an exponentially quicker turnaround in the last probably 2 or 3 years than the last 10 years. I mean, ultimately, this all started with a case in Canada called R.V. Parker. And the R for your American audience stands for Regina or Regina, which is Latin for queen. In times of a king or a sitting king in England, it would be Rex versus and the name. And so at R.V. Parker, Regina V. Parker, was Terry Parker, a epileptic cannabis user who essentially got arrested and charged for production of cannabis contrary to the Narcotic Control Act, as it was known in those times. Now it's the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And in fact, to be even more precise, cannabis is regulated solely now under the Cannabis Act. Any parts to do with it under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act have now been removed. But in those days, Terry Parker was basically growing cannabis and had the choice of using his medicine or going to jail. And so the federal or Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the fact that there was no medical exemption created for medical use, this put Mr. Parker's life, liberty, and security of the person at risk. And so ultimately, there's been this line of reasonable patient access that the government, since 2002, has been frog marched toward by lawyers suing them in court on charter grounds. And so we've gone from a state where the courts have pronounced that the government must provide some form of reasonable access, but has failed to do so, right up to and including our present legalization, because medical patients cannot go to a licensed producer to get cannabis. Why? Because none of the licensed producers have an adequate supply. They've all sold out, basically sold to the recreational market, which is different than the medical market because you have excise tax and price and all sorts of other things that don't come into play when the state subsidizes and controls and regulates or is supposed to regulate access to a medicine effectively, and they haven't. So like Terry Parker, the case that we brought to court with our dispensary test case, essentially, and we have a reserved judgment on this, is that medical patients are in the same boat. They either have to try to access their medicine from the government mail order system where they can't and has failed them, or they go to their local dispensary that is selling medicine that has been grown and sourced locally to some instances, and is being sold direct to the consumer with minimal involvement and intervention from the government. And so ultimately, the government has issue with a lot of this because, they feel that the legal system, with all these outrageous prices and restrictions and problems of access, should be used as a means for raising government revenue. Now, I'm all for raising government revenue. I am a believer in the state, but it's up for the government to design a system that's going to work. And just because they've designed a system that's a failure and not working, I feel no obligation as a citizen to follow that. In fact, I think it would be the duty of any good citizen not to follow or support a state system that's a failure, because doing that just reinforces, it's just reinforcing and rewarding failure. And that's ultimately, we can't afford to have any failure when it comes down to patient access and patient livelihood.
if we could put you in charge of the Canadian law and how cannabis is regulated there, what would be the most important provisions or aspects of how you would like to see it set up?
Okay, well, let's let's just take a deep breath here. Yeah, no, it's a good question. What would I do? Well, there's not enough supply. Okay, and if there's not enough supply, we have to ask ourselves, what then is the reason for that? Well, if the government's not issuing licenses quick enough, then we got to go further and ask, well, why not? And if the answer is that there's too many restrictions or the rules are too onerous, then we got to look to those and ask ourselves, why do they need to be? So ultimately, the government, because I highlighted, has set up a system that's designed to failure. It would fail. What I would do is you need to lower the bar. Again, cannabis does not need to be grown under the restrictions that are in place. I agree that there needs to be something safe and there needs to be something that makes sense. But let's face it, are these issues that the government are proclaiming the need to be growing a plant indoors under vault-like conditions with security, is it necessary? And I say it isn't, which means this cannabis and the production of it, if the industry is regulated how it should be, which is the production of flower cannabis, which again, let me just deal with the production of flower cannabis. Ultimately, because that's an agricultural product, the regulation of it should be a race to the bottom, whereby we get the best product at the lowest price. Now, if you have good bud and there's a lot of it and people are growing properly, that is good for consumers and it's good for patients. It means there's going to be an abundance of variety at a low cost, right? However, when we look at extracts and edibles, well, that's a different market altogether, because you're now taking a product, an agricultural product, and converting it into something where there's a patent and a process and potentially a outcome that can be copyrighted. I think, yeah, that's where there's perhaps a need for greater regulation. But ultimately, for patients to access their own supply of cannabis, that can be remedied very easily by lowering the barriers to entry. When the government initially, under the medical marijuana purpose regulations, this is back in about 2014, when they changed and implemented the first set of laws whereby these licensed producers like Aurora, Tilray, Canopy, etc., all came into fruition. Basically, yeah, they created a system where only cannabis could be produced in this manner, in this way, involving, and one part of it involved having a vault, like a security vault, where again, in the event that thieves are dumb enough to raid a facility to steal a plant, when, let's face it, everyone could be growing this, which means it should be pennies for pounds, we wouldn't have this problem. We'd have a problem being able to differentiate from quality cannabis from bad cannabis. And ultimately, with an abundance of good supply, no one's going to buy crappy, rushed produced cannabis that's infested or has mold. This is what I don't understand. But if it's restricted, you're going to force, as it is in Canada, you're forcing the good industry and the participants who should be allowed to participate but can't, but for criminal convictions and other arbitrary reasons for why arguably a cannabis expert can't participate in the industry, make no sense. And this was all done not for the best interests of the patient or ultimately the recreational user. This whole model under the MMPR and ACMPR was designed, lobbied, and provided for by a good number of the licensed producers who are all backed by the same hedge fund MCAP partners, right? So if you lobby the government for a mousetrap that only works in your favor and other limited instances and creates a monopoly, Well, of course. And if you demonize any competition or substitute to that as the black market or being illegal and have the force of law behind it, yeah, you're going to cause a lot of damage. And so any threat to that monopoly or oligarchy, such as John Conroy and Kirk Tusaw and the 36,000 patients who brought the litigation in the Allard case, Allard v. The federal government of Canada, based on the federal government's restriction when they repealed the MMAR and replaced it with the MMPR, which effectively made it illegal for anybody but a licensed producer to grow cannabis. And that case was won, meaning that medical patients have the right to grow and produce medical cannabis and access it in all of its forms. And that access it in all of its forms came with the R.V. Owen Smith decision, which had to do with edibles. So ultimately, the Allard case, the Smith case, going all the way back to the Allard or the Parker case, the epileptic I mentioned with the seizures, all of this has been the government not doing the right best interest of the people, but it's the courts and patient advocates and lawyers making charter and constitutional arguments which have frog marched the government or is frog marching the government towards greater patient access. And so that's why I think it's an exciting time, because what is legal now is possibly going to change significantly if we get our ruling in court for the test case.
That's a lot happening.
And actually, before we go on to the next topic, I'm awaiting the outcome of a decision. I have a reserved judgment tomorrow coming out on another matter involving a business license for an applicant in the city of Victoria, which is the capital of the city of British Columbia and is located at the southern tip of Vancouver Island. And 2 weeks ago, I appeared before Mayor and Council on a special emergency rehearing of a denied business license, whereby a dispensary operator was not licensing or was not applying for a license for a dispensary. His application was for what he called a safe consumption site, whereby he would not be selling or providing any cannabis, but more rather providing a safe space for medical or rec users to use cannabis. And so here you have a municipality which has attempted to license dispensaries, which ultimately under our constitution is illegal to do so. They've also created a business license regarding the sale of paraphernalia like bongs, pipes, and so on. Technically under section, it's either 462.2 or 362.2 of the criminal code, but paraphernalia related to marijuana still remains illegal. Yet the city of Victoria have licensed that. But they denied the business license for a place for people to use their marijuana and to use their paraphernalia safely, but that was denied on the grounds that they'd be consuming cannabis on site. Well, what else would you be doing with your cannabis, right? And so ultimately, if you live in a strata or a rental unit or an apartment where you cannot consume medical cannabis on site, where are you supposed to go, right? Use your medicine out in the rain? No, right? Even if you're at work and you say take medical cannabis, well, I could see there being huge repercussions or concerns or unduly scaring or threatening your security of the workplace by smoking your medical cannabis at the office or on office property, or even smelling of cannabis going back to your desk. At least by having a safe consumption site. And this safe consumption site was located 2 doors from City Hall in which is a bit of a rough neighborhood where kids aren't going to be down there anyway, nor are they going to be interested in medical or recreational users consuming cannabis, right? So ultimately, if the government grants or the Victoria City government grant the license tomorrow, we have a win. It'll be the first safe consumption lounge for cannabis that a municipality is granted. But if they don't, well, we will be filing a judicial review whereby we can make charter arguments before a judge in the Supreme Court under judicial review proceedings to see whether or not through the city of Victoria's failure to license the business license, whether or not that in itself has been a restriction or an impediment to the Section 7 right to reasonable, dignified medical access to cannabis. So this is why, I'm really at the middle of some interesting legal battles, but it really falls at the tail end of this 25 years or the litany of litigation that John Conroy QC and a handful of other lawyers have been in the trenches battling out of the prison reform. And because of the illegality of cannabis and prohibition, right, as I touched on earlier, essentially that's where a lot of the expertise and procedural and regulatory change has come from. Not the government doing the right thing, but it's come from patients or operators lawyering up and taking the government to task in the courts through constitutional and charter litigation.
And it reminds me of what's so interesting about Canada, something like the Netherlands, where there's been so much happening that's been tolerated, like dispensaries, but have been illegal. And it's a fascinating way to do it. We're going to let this go on. We're not going to have the state involved. They're just not going to touch this thing. And I'm glad that, through the work of yourself and other activist lawyers are trying to finally legalize these things that have already been happening.
Well, let's look at the Netherlands. I mean, it's still illegal on the books in the Netherlands. The cannabis that is sold out the front door of a dispensary or a head shop or coffee shop or whatever the tag you want to give it, right, is ultimately illegal. But the operator has a license, essentially dealing with the business licensing and the land use. And that's effectively what in Vancouver, which they became the first city to license. And when they did, they claimed that, well, we're doing this because of medical reasons and to facilitate medical access due to the fact that in 2015, what had, gone from a handful, like 10 dispensaries in a number of years, is proliferating at 100 plus. But ultimately, these dispensaries are providing access to a medicine that you cannot get through the legal program. And at the moment, legally, under the Canadian medical and recreational system, all one can access is bud flower and oil with a carrier like olive oil or coconut, whatever. That's it. So your butter, shatter, wax, any form of concentrate, whether it's BHO or CO2, or edibles or hash, keef, any of those other derivatives, that's still technically illegal. And so a medical patient who, let's say, has been trying to produce that themselves and they can't, well, what other option do they have? They got to get it somewhere. And so the government, because they're trying to create this illegal monopoly so that there is no competition, so that MCAP partners and the LPs that are under their umbrella have this dominant position, which honestly is doing nothing but mess with and frustrate the efforts of genuine medical patients and folks who should be able to access this, whether it's for medical or rec purposes. The government ultimately, I feel, is playing a part where their continued barriers and the frustrations they're putting up are constitutionally protected activities that they're frustrating. And so we've had not just Canada look into this, but recently Mexico pronounced a decision in the recreational context that the current government prohibitions and they basically said that the prohibition on cannabis was constitutionally incompatible or infringed the Constitution. I mean, that's in a rec context. The case we have before the Supreme Court of British Columbia and the Chief Justice deals with medical access. So again, I think that, you can never go wrong when you try to get to the high ground first and argue medical necessity over a right to access something recreationally, at least under the charter in Canada, right? That there is that distinction. And also, I haven't read the case yet, but South Africa, there was a recent judicial pronouncement along the same lines. So I think what we're seeing is the domino effect, with regard to cannabis. And sooner or later, I think the United States at the federal level will wise up, and that will allow the 50 states essentially to participate in a way that is competitive and makes sense. I mean, Hawaii is a fantastic example. You got 7 licenses at the moment, and there's what, 5 main islands? Well, between those islands is international water, which means it's federal territory. So just trying to get Hawaiian cannabis from one island to another involves the federal government. Getting Hawaiian cannabis to the mainland involves the federal government, right? So this is why I think it'll be so awesome and exciting to truly be able to access what the best of what the world has, but at the moment we can't.
How backwards it is.
And I get to do this for the next 35 years of my life. That's a lot of cannabis. That's a lot of change. So I mean, it has to change. The blinders are coming off the masses, who now are starting to differentiate. If this was like chocolate, they're starting to realize that the warehouses of the legal cannabis that's being mass produced and grown in Canada and in some of the legal US jurisdiction isn't Hershey's chocolate. It would be closer to Belgium chocolate. Or no, excuse me, it would be closer to Baker's chocolate. And the rec market really has no idea what Belgian chocolate looks like, because the rec market hasn't been around long enough yet. So this is where I think we're going to see, hopefully, quality and quantity get that balance right. Because at the moment, there's a lot of good cannabis out there, but I'm not seeing a lot of it being produced on these large quantity, large scale operations that are legal. And that's before you consider in water conservation or water consumption, electrical consumption, and other externalities that I can't see getting any cheaper over the next 5 to 10 years. If anything, it's going to get even more regulated, more expensive to grow high caliber cannabis indoors in vault-like conditions, meaning that we're going to see more and more people being able to not justify prohibitions on outdoor cultivation. At the moment, there's a huge prohibition on outdoor cultivation, which should slowly be lifted. But it just, to me, angers me when, the evidence is clear. Carbon trading isn't the answer. Just grow more plants, offset the carbon that way. So I don't know. I think that legalized cannabis, there's a lot of fluff, and puffery to it, like we see with carbon trading and offsetting.
And speaking of the business side, which is another important driver of all of this, can you talk about your work with Liberty Leaf Holdings and your other business consultings and interests?
Well, I'm the chairman of their advisory board, and that's been an excellent opportunity in that, it's enabled me to assist a company, one of the earliest mining companies that essentially did a relisting so that it could participate in the cannabis space. And ultimately, they have, with the majority, have had to go through some pretty serious licensing and expenditure in the hopes that they, will hopefully get their licenses soon. And so for me, it's been very illuminating being the chairman to a legally publicly traded company, but being able to also have the insights of the black market through the representation of dispensary owners, operators, and proprietors who have been operating outside of the legal framework. And so ultimately, regardless of if it's Liberty Leaf or any of the other companies or businesses that I advise or provide counsel to, I'm able to provide basically both sides of the same coin with regards to regulations, legality, illegality, the criminal law, administrative litigation, coupled and matched with charter and constitutional practice. So ultimately, those are skills and experience that any legal business in the cannabis space, whether it's Canada or the United States or Europe or where have you, there aren't a lot of lawyers who've been on or been involved in this space for a number of years and have also, derivative experience gained from working for the alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceutical companies, which again, that's some of the work I did in England before I made the shift.
One last question before we let you go. What's most exciting for you coming up in this sphere?
Well, I have to say the most exciting thing coming up, Will, is the fact that I have 2 reserved judgments. Once we get some clarification from the courts, and we'll know whether or not the government if they'll appeal our decision or not, but in any event, getting a ruling in our dispensary charter challenge test case, I think will be pretty phenomenal, because as indicated, what we're seeing now will totally change with that. And because it involves some badly needed direction from the court regarding, the bounds and restrictions of when a municipality can, regulate a controlled substance or a constitutionally demarcated product that is under the providence of the federal government. And because municipalities haven't had delegated authority from the provincial government, it'll be interesting to see how or if the Chief Justice can reconcile what the city of Vancouver has done on all that. That's going to be exciting, because regardless of what comes, this industry is going to have to continue to adapt and change. And actually, maybe this is a good way to conclude, but as a young kid, I loved the movie The Firm, the John Grisham novels. And the movie has this great scene with Gene Hackman as the senior tax lawyer giving advice to Tom Cruise. And a lot of being a cannabis lawyer at this time and space is very much like the reality of being a tax lawyer, in that just like a tax lawyer, the government changes the law, we advise our clients, and then the government changes the law again. On the one hand, it's an endless cycle. But, out of this cycle, I'm hoping that barriers to access and patients' ability to acquire their medicine are easier. And that's what I'll keep doing till we get a decision that achieves that.
Excellent. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your work and for taking the time to talk to us today. We'll link to your column in Grow Magazine in our episode notes, as well as other sites about your work. And thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you. And you know what? It'd be great to have a follow-up episode down the road when we get some of these reserved judgments back, and we can go from there.
Great. I look forward to it. Thank you. Greener Grass is a BlueBird Botanicals podcast. Their CBD oil supports a healthy body and a strong endocannabinoid system. They've got friendly customer service who can answer any of your questions, and the number is right there at the top of their webpage. But, per the FDA, they won't be able to make any medical claims for these nutritional supplements. That's also the reason you'll hear little about CBD on this show. There's no need for us to add more evidence about CBD when a simple Google search will give you more than you can read in a month of Sundays. So this show covers the cannabis world and more with editorial freedom from BlueBird Botanicals. Thanks for joining the Greener Grass podcast. As always, our audio alchemist is Matt Payne. The Gypsy Jazz theme music comes from Brett Van Donsel. Our beautiful bird sounds are courtesy of Lang Elliott. And I'm your host, Lex Pelger, wishing you a bright green day.